Hello, and welcome to History 300, the origins of the First World War. Lecture 16, Germany's Blank Check and the Ultimatum to Serbia, July the 5th to July the 23rd, 1914. On the early morning of July the 5th, 1914, Count Hoyos, Austrian Chancellor Berchtold's deputy, arrived in Berlin carrying the two documents that had been entrusted to him by the Viennese government. The personal letter to the German Emperor from Franz Joseph I, requesting diplomatic assistance against the murderers of Franz Ferdinand, and the memorandum prepared by Berchtold, proposing that the Serbs be isolated and punished for their misdeeds. At lunch that day, after being briefed by Hoyos, the Austro-Hungarian ambassador to Germany sat down with the Kaiser to discuss the issue. The Kaiser agreed in principle that action needed to be taken against Serbia, but indicated that he would need to discuss the matter with his own ministers before taking any definite position. That afternoon, Hoyos met with Arthur Zimmermann, the German deputy foreign minister, and laid out in more detail Austria's plans. Serbia, said Hoyos, was to be immediately invaded, and most of its territory divided up by Austria Hungary, Bulgaria, and Albania. That evening, Zimmermann and the Chancellor, Theobald Bethmann-Hollweg, met in council with the Kaiser to discuss Germany's response to this proposal. The Kaiser had been personally devastated by Franz Ferdinand's murder, partly because of their genuine friendship, and partly because the assassination ruined Wilhelm's long-term strategic plans for Austro-German relations. He had been carefully nurturing his relationship with Franz Ferdinand, knowing that the younger man would soon enough inherit the Habsburg throne. All that work had come to nothing. He was angry. Previously, the Kaiser had shared with Franz Ferdinand the belief that war between Austria and Serbia was unwise, given the fragile state of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Now Wilhelm, as he so often did, swung to the opposite extreme. The Serbs had proven themselves to be barbarians by this act. They had to be punished. And his government would back such actions to the hilt. Emperor Franz Joseph must be assured that even in this critical hour we shall not abandon him, said Wilhelm. The following day, July the 6th, Bethmann met with Hoyos to give him Berlin's decision. The Austrians, he said, should feel free to act against Serbia with full German support. If Russia tried to interfere, Germany would support its ally. This was the famous blank check of unconditional support that the Germans offered the Austrians as a result of the Hoyos mission. An offer that at least some of Wilhelm's ministers would later come to bitterly regret. Many historians too would later come to see the blank check as an act of criminal irresponsibility by Germany, wantonly encouraging the Austrians to pursue a line of action that was bound to provoke general European war. That's an issue we'll come to again later. But the Kaiser and his ministers don't seem to have regarded the commitment they made on July the 5th as an exceptionally dangerous one at the time. After all, Hoyos had spoken of immediate military action against Serbia. This was something that was going to happen at lightning speed, while the shock and indignation about Franz Ferdinand's murder was still fresh in everyone's minds. If Austrian troops marched into Belgrade within a few days, the Russians and French would surely not have time to coordinate any coherent response. Serbia would be crushed before the crisis could spill over from a local into a general conflict. In other words, Germany's support would be largely symbolic. There was little danger of the blank check ever having to be actually cashed. Satisfied that everything was underhand, Wilhelm agreed to head off for his previously scheduled summer vacation in the Norwegian fjords. Bethmann told him that this was wise because it would discourage any gossip that the Germans were colluding with the Austrians. He probably also wanted to get the Kaiser as far away from Berlin as possible. Wilhelm, after all, was notorious for changing his mind at the last minute. Hoyos returned to Vienna on July the 6th with the blank check in his pocket and reported to Berchtold on the happy results of his mission. The Austrian foreign minister assembled a war council on July the 7th to discuss what to do next. Having received the guarantee of German support, Berchtold proposed to the assembled ministers that Austria should launch an immediate surprise attack on Serbia within the next couple of days if possible. Conrad, the Austrian chief of staff, strongly supported such a move. But the Hungarian Prime Minister István Tisza was horrified. If you recall, Tisza had been unenthusiastic about war with Serbia from the beginning. Now, reading Hoyos's account of his discussions with Zimmermann, he was particularly appalled at the revelation that Austria planned to carve up Serbia and annex some of its territory. Under no circumstances, said Tisza, should Austria Hungary take in any more Serbs than it already had. Tisza made a counter-proposal. If any action was to be taken, it must be preceded by a careful diplomatic build-up first. This was to prevent other Balkan states perhaps joining in to defend Serbia. The Hungarians were particularly worried that Romania might take an opportunity to attack Hungarian-controlled Transylvania. Austria, said Tisza, should send Belgrade an ultimatum, first demanding that the Serbs concede to certain conditions. If the Serbs caved in, it would be a great diplomatic victory in its own right. And if they did not, then perhaps war would be appropriate. But even then, Austria would have to make a public declaration that it would not seize any territory from Serbia. Berchtold and the other ministers at the council were deeply unhappy at all this, but Tisza had them over a barrel. Action was impossible without Hungarian agreement. Very reluctantly, Berchtold agreed to begin preparations for an ultimatum to be drawn up. The meeting ended then, with no definite decision being made. The next 2 weeks would pass with almost complete radio silence between Vienna and Berlin. Bethmann-Hollweg and his German colleagues were left increasingly perplexed and frustrated. When Hoyos had left Berlin on July the 6th, it seemed as though everything had been agreed. The Austrians would start moving against Serbia almost immediately. But nothing had happened. The German ambassador in Vienna requested an update on what was going on. Why hadn't the Austrians attacked? Berchtold assured him all was well. Plans were underway. Austria would act no later than July the 15th. In fact, at the time he offered this reassurance, Berchtold already knew full well that this was untrue. For one thing, Tisza had insisted that the wording of any ultimatum would have to be pre-approved before it was dispatched at a full Imperial Council, and that could not meet until July the 19th at the earliest. For another thing, Conrad, although the most hawkish of all the war hawks, had made an embarrassing discovery. It turned out that a large proportion of the Austrian army had just been furloughed in order to provide manpower for the summer harvest. There was no way of getting all these men back to their barracks early without causing chaos to the food production schedule, and, perhaps more important, blatantly giving the game away that something was afoot. In other words, no ultimatum would be possible until July the 22nd at the earliest. These delays, though entirely characteristic of the way things worked in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, would turn out to be crucial to the way the July crisis unfolded. They made it possible for news of the ultimatum to leak out, allowing the French and Russians to begin coordinating plans for a response. They also allowed the shock effect of the assassination to weaken. In the weeks immediately following Franz Ferdinand's death, Europe's sympathy lay entirely with Austria. Had the Austrians been able or willing to capitalise on this and act immediately against Serbia, it's possible that they might well have gotten away with it without provoking any resistance from the other great powers. But almost 4 weeks passed between Franz Ferdinand's murder and the Austrian ultimatum to Serbia. The shock effect ebbed away. Austria's actions simply no longer looked like righteous anger in the heat of the moment, but of cynical and carefully planned opportunism conducted in cold blood. By their delays, the Austrians gave up the key moral high ground in the crisis, and they never got it back. On July the 19th, the Second Vienna War Council met to discuss the specific terms of the ultimatum to Serbia. Tisza, though he remained unenthusiastic about war, understood by this point that he was isolated amongst the other Austro-Hungarian ministers, and he could not continue his strategy of resistance forever. He conceded to the plan. The ultimatum, drawn up by Berchtold personally, was delivered to the Austro-Hungarian embassy in Belgrade the following day in a sealed envelope. The ambassador was instructed not to open it until given specific instructions to do so. One final delay now inserted itself. The Austrians were aware of the French President and Prime Minister's state visit to St. Petersburg. They wanted, if at all possible, to prevent Poincaré and Viviani from being able to discuss with Sazonov a detailed response to the ultimatum in person. So it was decided to delay the handing over of the document until early evening on July the 23rd, which would be a few hours after the French delegation would have left Russia and be heading back to France. On the afternoon of July the 23rd, the Austrian ambassador informed the Serbian government that he would be delivering an important message later that day. He arrived at the Serbian Foreign Ministry just before 6 p.m. There, a somewhat comic scene ensued. Serbia's Prime Minister, Pasic, suspecting what the message would probably consist of, had already left town. His deputies at the Foreign Ministry apologised, explaining that Pasic was out of town making general election campaign speeches. In his absence, nobody had the authority to accept such an important message. Could the ambassador come back some other day, perhaps? Eventually, the Austrian ambassador lost patience. He placed the document on a table and told the Serbs they could do what they liked with it. He then strode out of the building. In the next lecture, we'll look at what the Serbian response to this Austrian ultimatum actually was and how events unfolded in the following days. See you then.